In this lesson, we'll continue our analysis of some of the negative consequences of bureaucracy. But before we begin, I want you to take a moment and focus on one of the negative consequences we examined in the previous lesson. It's found on page 5 of your third study guide, and it's referred to as the iron law of oligarchy. It's also highlighted in chapter 5 in your textbook. This, I hope, will reacquaint you with Michael's argument. And I mention this in particular because I want you to review a study highlighted in chapter 5 in your text. Fox and Arquette's research of a number of local posts of this organization, the VFW. Relate Michael's concept of the iron law of oligarchy to the research done by these two sociologists as to who actually ended up serving in leadership positions in the posts that they analyzed. But in this lesson, we're going to start off by focusing on another negative consequence of bureaucratic structures. This one, like Parkinson's law, is a bit satirical in nature. And like Parkinson's law, it's pretty difficult to implement via scientific research. But Lawrence Peter referred to it as the Peter Principle. And on page 5 in your study guide, it refers to the fact that bureaucrats rise to their level of incompetency. It might be highlighted in this particular way. According to Peter, in a hierarchy, and this is a direct quote, in a hierarchically structured administration, people tend to be promoted up to their level of incompetency. He also put it in somewhat simpler terms. Another direct quote, the cream rises until it sours. So in a bureaucratically structured organization, people get promoted basically due to how well they're performing their current job. They keep getting promoted until they get into a position for which they are completely incompetent. An example of this, go back to, again, the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina. Michael D. Brown was the head of FEMA at the time. Remember, again, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. He was a friend and appointee of then President George W. Bush. But he turned out to be kind of a victim of poor promotion. He had been given the job of the directorship of FEMA based upon, again, the fact that not only was he a friend of the president, but he was pretty good at his previous job, which was Commissioner of Judges for the International Arabian Horse Association. He was great in that particular position. But once he got into the FEMA position, he got in over his head. And keep in mind, he took the job because it was almost part of the American dream. It was, again, a job of great prestige, status, good salary, potential for growth. But he got in over his head very, very quickly. And he eventually requested to be removed. And there's a famous line that he was said to have uttered, "Can I quit now?" So again, Peter made the argument that in any organization, people will eventually get promoted to a point where they are just lousy. Now, if this is true, how does anything get done within an organization itself? Well, Peter pointed out the fact that once an employee reaches his or her level of incompetency, in general, unless they're just really, really bad, they're not going to get fired. They're going to spend a lot of their time, even though they're mediocre at best, covering up the fact that they're not really good at what they're doing. The bulk of the work within the organization or the company is carried out by regular employees who form the base of the hierarchical pyramid. And they're the ones that make companies go. Plus, you want to add one other point. There are people within the hierarchy who are satisfied doing what they're doing, and they're good at it, and they really don't want to move up the scale. It's these folks, according to Peter, that are doing most of the work. Now, another issue that I wanted to address, which is not included directly in the study guide, and it's more or less generalized within the context of your textbook, is that there is an informal side to bureaucracy. Weber never really focused a lot of attention on that. It's what some sociologists refer to as the other face of bureaucracy. First insights into it came through that famous series of studies done at the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric back in the late 1920s. You might remember us discussing this in an earlier class session with respect to the fact that the researchers discovered, while they were studying 14 men working in what was called the wiring bank room. These were men who were wiring phone switchboards, that they kind of enjoyed the attention they were getting from the researchers and wanted to please them. And we talked about the Hawthorne effect being that when we know our behavior is being observed by others, we don't necessarily behave in the way we normally would. Well, what also grew out of this study at the Hawthorne plant is the fact that the researchers discovered that among the workers, primary group associations developed. And it was these primary groups that set up their own norms, rules, and regulations. Some of these might not have been in keeping with the larger organization. For example, the researchers discovered that although the company offered monetary incentives for greater productivity, it was the workers who set up their own standards or norms related to work. Nobody was supposed to be a rate buster, what the workers called a speed king. You weren't supposed to do too much work too quickly. On the other hand, you weren't supposed to be a chiseler. You were not expected to put out too little work where someone had to cover your tail. Furthermore, no one was expected to say anything to a supervisor that might be harmful to another worker. A person who did this was referred to as a squealer. And if you happen to be an inspector, a couple of the 14 workers in the wiring bank room were just that, you weren't supposed to act like you were a big-time official. If you violated any of these informal guidelines or rules, you ended up being slapped around the head and the shoulders, what was referred to as binging. The researchers also discovered that communication systems develop within the workplace that get around the more formal and somewhat cumbersome official channels of communication. For example, they discovered that the rank and file rarely, again, focused on what was coming through official channels, but they turned to unofficial channels, the grapevine, for information they needed. Likewise, the researchers discovered, and some of you probably are aware of this as well, that those who happen to be in secondary or lower rank positions sometimes end up having far more power and authority than their job title suggests. Sometimes it's the non-commissioned officers in the military, not the higher-ups, or secretaries or assistants, who end up being the ones in the know. And they're the ones that are going to get things done, per se. I remember, again, when I first read about this study, I found it interesting, but it just blew right over my head. But I came to realize the power of these informal groups within the organization. And again, you want to remember, when you go back to the study itself, Why in the world didn't these workers take advantage of the company's promise for higher wages for increased production? Well, the researchers in the study discovered that the workers thought if they produced at a higher rate, that would then become the established work rate. Furthermore, the workers were quite comfortable and satisfied with the situation because they believed they had some degree of control of the workplace. They felt empowered, if you will. And furthermore, they were a little bit concerned that greater work productivity might result in some people being laid off, since the higher-ups could think that the same output or results might be achieved by fewer workers, something they didn't want. Well, this came to me in a flash during one of the summers while I was in college. I worked in a fuel pump factory in my hometown. You don't hear too much about fuel pumps anymore because almost all automobiles are fuel injected. But I was in a department called disassembly. My job was to back out 4 screws and break a fuel pump into its 2 primary parts. Within each part, there were a series of smaller parts. I had to get these smaller parts, toss them into appropriate barrels, and I had a rate that I was supposed to complete within an hour. First night on the job, one of the old hands been working there for 25 years, showed me the ropes. And I remember when he finished, he got right down in my face and told me, "Listen, Sonny, there's one thing you better never forget. Don't ever break the rate, and don't be a lazy ass." Well, I let that fly right over my head. I was a snotty nose, wet behind the ears, smart, at least jerk-like college student. And by the end of the first week, I blew the top out of the rate. And I felt very proud of myself. Golly, some of these guys have been working here for 25 years and they're still struggling. In 1 week, I blew the top out of the rate. So I proudly marched into the night manager's office. I was on the night shift, threw down my counter, and I remember he looked at it and he must have blinked a good 2 minutes. And then, in a somewhat hesitant way, he said, "Are you sure you want me to turn in all these extra pieces?" Well, I was so proud and so smug that I said, "Absolutely, man." Well, the next night I came in for work. We were working 6-night-a-week shifts. And some of the old hands who had been very friendly and supportive of me were somewhat decidedly cool. Several of them actually turned their back. A couple of them kind of scowled at me, made bad faces. Well, I checked under each armpit to make sure that I had deodorant, and I kept thinking, what's going on? But I went over, got set up, and I remember that there was one member of the Department of Disassembly who could have passed for a middle linebacker on any NFL football team. He was huge. We walked over to my workstation, reached out, and grabbed me around the back of the neck. And then he pulled me up to him and jammed me into his shoulder. And I was kind of like that. And then he began going into great detail about what he was going to do to soft parts of my anatomy if I ever again broke the rate. Now, I learned at that particular point that, yeah, the company says, do all you possibly can. Be as productive as you possibly can. But I realized if I was going to live, and I definitely wanted to live, I was going to have to conform to the norms of the workplace. Classic example of this informal side, or, if you wish, the other face of bureaucracy. Until next time.